Before we begin, if you enjoy calm, documentary-style stories about real treasure, forgotten discoveries, and the long consequences of history, consider liking the video and subscribing. It helps the channel more than you might think, and ensures these stories continue. Throughout American history, thousands of people searched for gold believing that discovery was the final step. They were wrong. In many cases, the hardest moment did not come during the search, but after success. According to historical records, some of the most promising gold discoveries in the United States were made in places where extraction was never allowed to begin. The gold was real. The assays were confirmed. The locations were documented, and then access was denied. In these cases, there was no mystery about whether gold existed. Geological surveys verified it. Prospectors held samples in their hands. Reports were filed. Maps were drawn. What followed was not a rush, but a closure. Land classifications changed. Boundaries were enforced. Military zones expanded. National parks were designated. Environmental protections were introduced. Private ownership claims overrode discovery rights. Gold, once found, became irrelevant. Later, historical analysis indicates that these moments marked a quiet shift in the American treasure narrative. The story was no longer about who found gold first, but who controlled the land beneath it. Discovery lost its power. For the men and women who made these finds, the realization came slowly. They had done everything history told them to do. They followed the signs, endured the conditions, and located real value. But the rules had changed. Gold was no longer enough. In earlier periods of American expansion, discovery often meant possession. Gold rushes were built on that assumption. Find something valuable, stake a claim, and extract what you could. The land was vast, enforcement was minimal, and authority often arrived after the fact. By the early 20th century, this logic began to collapse. According to contemporary accounts, prospectors increasingly encountered a new reality. Land could be restricted even if it appeared empty. Ownership could exist without presence. Authority could be enforced without negotiation. Gold discoveries started colliding with systems. Federal lands were no longer neutral ground. Military reservations expanded quietly, often absorbing mineral-rich regions. National parks were drawn around landscapes that included known gold deposits. Private land titles, sometimes issued decades earlier, suddenly mattered more than discovery itself. Geology no longer decided outcomes. Administration did. Later historical analysis suggests that this transition fundamentally altered the psychology of treasure hunting in the United States. The idea that effort and risk would be rewarded became uncertain. Success depended less on finding gold and more on navigating permissions, classifications, and restrictions. Some prospectors tried to challenge these limits. Most did not. The cost of legal battles exceeded the value of extraction. In other cases, permits were technically possible, but practically unreachable. Time, money, and bureaucracy replaced pickaxes and pans. Gold remained underground, and slowly, a new category of treasure emerged. Not lost, not hidden, but found and unreachable. The places where gold was discovered but never taken were not marginal or remote anomalies. They were often located in regions already known for wealth. According to geological surveys conducted throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, significant gold deposits were identified across the western United States, in California, Arizona, Nevada, Colorado, New Mexico, and parts of Alaska. In many of these areas, early prospecting overlapped with land that would later be reclassified. The gold was not speculative. Rock samples were analysed. Veins were traced. Assays confirmed purity and volume. In some cases, deposits rivaled or exceeded those of nearby districts that had already produced fortunes. But timing mattered. As the federal government expanded its role in land management, classifications began to harden. What had once been loosely defined frontier land became mapped, zoned, and regulated. Military needs, conservation priorities, and long-term resource planning took precedence over individual extraction. In California, several gold-bearing regions fell within boundaries that would later become national parks or protected forests. Early prospectors documented gold-bearing quartz veins and placer deposits in areas that were eventually sealed off entirely. In Arizona and New Mexico, military reservations absorbed land rich in minerals. Gold was identified during surveys, but access was denied once boundaries were enforced. The deposits were acknowledged and left untouched. In Nevada, some discoveries occurred on land that transitioned into federal control before claims could be formalized. Prospectors arrived too late to stake legal ownership, even with proof of discovery. Later, historical analysis shows a consistent pattern. Gold existed, knowledge existed, but permission did not. These locations were not forgotten. They were recorded, indexed, and studied. Their value was known, not only to prospectors, but to institutions responsible for managing the land. The treasure was not hidden by chance. It was buried beneath policy. For the individuals who found this gold, the denial of access rarely came dramatically. There were no armed confrontations, no sudden arrests, no dramatic expulsions. Instead, there were notices. According to contemporary accounts, prospectors often learned the truth after the discovery had already been made. A letter from a land office, a conversation with a ranger, a posted boundary sign encountered too late. The language was bureaucratic. This land is not open to mineral entry. Claims cannot be recognized within this boundary. Extraction is prohibited under current designation. The message was final. Some prospectors tried to adapt. They applied for permits. They sought exemptions. They hired surveyors and lawyers. In rare cases, limited exploration was allowed, but full extraction remained impossible. Time worked against them. Permits expired. Boundaries shifted. Regulations tightened. What might have been possible for one generation became prohibited for the next. Later historical analysis indicates that many of these cases ended not with rejection, but with exhaustion. The cost of persistence outweighed the potential reward. Gold left underground had no market value. The emotional impact was muted, but profound. Unlike lost treasure, this gold could not inspire legends. Unlike stolen treasure, there was no villain. There was only an impersonal system that acknowledged value without allowing access to it. Prospectors walked away not because the gold wasn't there, but because the rules made it irrelevant. And in doing so, they became witnesses to a new reality. In modern America, discovery no longer guaranteed ownership. By the time many of these gold discoveries were made, the question was no longer what lay underground. It was who decided what could be done with it. According to historical records, the expansion of federal land control in the United States fundamentally changed the balance between discovery and authority. Large portions of the American West were no longer viewed primarily as opportunity zones for individual extraction, but as strategic assets to be managed in the long term. Control came from multiple directions. Military reservations expanded to secure training grounds, testing areas, and strategic corridors. National parks were established to preserve landscapes considered culturally or environmentally significant. Federal forests and protected lands were designated to regulate resource use rather than accelerate it. In each case, gold became secondary. Later historical analysis suggests that these decisions were not primarily anti-mining. They reflected a broader shift in national priorities. Stability security, and conservation increasingly outweighed the benefits of short-term extraction by private individuals. The land itself became the treasure. Gold deposits were acknowledged, catalogued, and sometimes even studied, but extraction was postponed indefinitely. The value was recognized, but deliberately left unrealized. This marked a reversal of earlier American logic. During the 19th century, land existed to be used. By the 20th century, land existed to be managed. Ownership no longer flowed from effort or discovery, but from classification and designation. Prospectors found themselves outside this new framework. They had gold samples, maps, and geological proof, but none of it granted authority. Control had shifted upward, away from individuals and toward institutions tasked with thinking in decades rather than seasons. Gold was no longer enough to justify access. Given the apparent value of these discoveries, one question lingers. Why didn't more people fight? According to contemporary accounts, the answer was rarely ideological. Prospectors did not abandon their claims because they agreed with the restrictions. They walked away because resistance was impractical. Legal challenges were expensive and slow. Court cases could stretch for years, often without guaranteeing access even if a ruling was favourable. In many cases, land designations were absolute, leaving no room for negotiation. Permits, when technically available, came with conditions that made extraction unviable. Environmental requirements, infrastructure limitations, and operational restrictions reduced potential profits to near zero. Time also played a role. Prospectors were not corporations. They operated on limited resources, narrow windows, and physical endurance. Years spent navigating bureaucracy were years not spent working or earning. Later historical analysis shows that many prospectors calculated their losses quietly. They assessed the cost of persistence against the likelihood of success and chose withdrawal. There was no dramatic ending. Equipment was packed away. Camps were dismantled. Maps were folded and stored. The gold remained underground, untouched and unchanged. What made these cases different from traditional treasure failures was the absence of uncertainty. The prospectors did not leave because the gold might not exist. They left knowing it did. This created a new category of loss, one defined not by chance or deception, but by access denied. And as these stories accumulated, they reshaped the expectations of future treasure seekers. Finding gold was no longer the finish line. Permission was. What makes these discoveries unusual is not that the gold was abandoned. It is that it was abandoned knowingly. According to historical records, many prospectors who encountered restricted land understood exactly what they were leaving behind. Assay reports confirmed value. Geological formations indicated continuity. In some cases, estimates suggested deposits large enough to support sustained extraction. Yet the decision to walk away was deliberate. This was not panic. It was calculation. Prospectors evaluated the cost of defiance, delay, and legal uncertainty against the certainty of restriction. In earlier eras, risk was measured against the possibility of reward. In these cases, risk was measured against permission, and permission was absent. Later historical analysis indicates that this marked a psychological turning point. Treasure hunting had always involved uncertainty about outcome. Now it involved certainty about denial. Gold could be found and still be unreachable. Some prospectors documented their findings meticulously before leaving. They recorded coordinates, geological structures, and sample results, not to extract, but to preserve evidence. Others chose silence. They packed up quietly, unwilling to advertise a discovery they could not claim. Public knowledge risked attracting attention, scrutiny, or legal consequences. In some cases, secrecy was the final form of control they retained. The gold was left not because it lacked value, but because acting on that value carried too much cost. This choice reshaped the meaning of success. For the first time, restraint became part of the treasure narrative. Knowing when to stop mattered as much as knowing where to dig. The treasure remained untouched, unclaimed, and officially acknowledged, waiting not for discovery, but for a change in circumstance that never came. The cumulative effect of these cases altered the culture of treasure hunting in the United States. According to later historical analysis, prospectors and small-scale miners began adjusting expectations. The idea that effort alone guaranteed reward weakened. Success became conditional, mediated by regulation rather than resolve. Treasure hunting moved from a physical challenge to an administrative one. Maps still mattered, geological skills still mattered, but so did land status, permitting frameworks, and long-term policy trends. Knowledge of boundaries became as important as knowledge of terrain. This shift discouraged some and redirected others. Independent prospecting declined in certain regions. Large operations with legal teams and institutional backing replaced individual efforts. Treasure hunting became less romantic and more procedural. At the same time, a quieter subculture emerged. Some seekers focused on documentation rather than extraction. They studied deposits, recorded histories, and preserved knowledge of places where gold existed but could not be taken. These records became a parallel archive, a map of unreachable wealth. Later generations inherited this awareness. Modern treasure hunters often speak not just of where gold might be found, but where it cannot be touched. The conversation includes access rights, environmental law, and ownership structures from the outset. The frontier had closed, not geographically, but administratively. Gold still existed beneath American soil, but the rules governing it had become permanent. Treasure hunting did not end. It changed form. Decades have passed since many of these discoveries were first recorded. The gold is still there. According to geological surveys and later historical analysis, numerous confirmed gold deposits remain untouched beneath American soil, not because they were exhausted, but because they were never allowed to be worked. These deposits exist in national parks, protected forests, military reservations, and restricted federal lands. In many cases, their locations are not speculative. They are documented, mapped, and understood. The knowledge has never disappeared. What changed was access. Some of these regions were deliberately excluded from future extraction plans. Others were effectively frozen by overlapping regulations that made mining legally possible in theory, but impossible in practice. Environmental protections tightened. Land use priorities shifted. Public interest moved toward preservation rather than production. Gold, once the reason towns were built and routes were carved, became secondary to landscape stability. Later historical analysis suggests that this outcome was intentional. Leaving gold underground reduced conflict, preserved ecosystems, and removed the economic volatility that resource rushes often created. The treasure became a constant rather than a catalyst. Its presence no longer triggered action. It simply existed, acknowledged, but inert. For modern prospectors, this creates a strange paradox. They operate in a country where gold is known to exist, yet entire categories of land are permanently off limits. Discovery is no longer the missing piece. Permission is. The ground holds value that no one is meant to touch. The decision to leave gold untouched has had lasting consequences beyond mining. According to later historical analysis, these policies reshaped regional economies. Areas that once might have experienced boom and bust cycles instead developed around stability, tourism, conservation, or military infrastructure. In this sense, the absence of extraction became a form of planning. By preventing rushes, authorities avoided the transient populations, inflated prices, and sudden collapses that characterized early gold regions. The cost was unrealized wealth. The benefit was predictability. This trade-off reflected a broader shift in American priorities. Treasure no longer justified disruption. Gold was no longer treated as an automatic good. It became one variable among many, weighed against environmental impact, national security, and long-term land use. For treasure seekers, this reframed success. The dream of striking it rich did not disappear, but it became constrained by systems designed to prevent exactly that kind of disruption. The modern treasure hunter operates within boundaries that earlier generations never faced. Gold still inspires search, but it no longer guarantees outcome. The greatest change was not physical. It was conceptual. Treasure became something that could exist without being claimed, and that idea, once unthinkable, became normal. The gold that was found, but never taken, challenges one of the oldest assumptions in the history of treasure hunting. That discovery is enough. For centuries, treasure meant a simple equation: effort led to discovery, and discovery led to ownership. The American gold rushes were built on this logic. Find something valuable, and the land would eventually bend around that fact. These stories show when that equation broke. The gold existed. The evidence was real. The discovery was legitimate. What failed was access. According to historical records and later analysis, these moments did not represent a failure of prospectors, nor a lack of courage or skill. They represented a shift in how value was governed. Land became more important than what lay beneath it. Systems replaced individuals as the final authority. Treasure did not disappear. It was redefined. Gold became something that could be acknowledged without being claimed. Something that could be known without being touched. Something that could remain valuable without ever being used. For the seekers who walked away, the loss was quiet. There were no empty vaults or stolen fortunes. Only knowledge, carried forward without reward. For the system that denied access, the outcome was stability. Fewer rushes. Few collapses, fewer moments when value overwhelmed control. And for history, something subtle changed. Treasure stopped being purely physical. It became conditional. The modern treasure hunter no longer asks only where something is hidden, but who decides whether it can be taken at all. Gold still waits beneath the ground in many places across the United States. Not lost, not forgotten, simply unreachable. And that leaves one final question. If a treasure can be real, confirmed, and valuable, yet never belong to anyone, is it still a treasure?